Now I will leave the floor to Professor Mario De Caro and to Professor Patricia Churchland.
Okay, I'll be brief. Just to give you an idea of how important Professor Churchland is for philosophy nowadays. A couple of remarks about what she has done. She has been a professor and she had a chair at the University of California, San Diego, where she is emerita now. And she got the MacArthur Prize, that's commonly known as a Genius Grant, to give you an idea. She has been the president of the American Philosophical Association and the Society for Philosophy and Psychology. And most recently, she got the very important prize of the Italian Neuroscience Society, Neuroethics Society. And besides that, let me give you just a very brief biographical remark. In 1986, Patricia Churchland wrote a book that would have become very famous, Neurophilosophy Toward the Unified Science on Mind-Brain. Very few years after, I was a visiting scholar at MIT. That was published by MIT Press. And I was a visiting scholar at MIT for a couple of years. And the same day I arrived, the first year, I had a dinner with two famous philosophers there, and we talked about that book. They said, oh, that's interesting, that's interesting. But their attitude was, that doesn't go very far. It's impossible. Why? Because philosophy, it was supposed, had to be done a priori. Armchair philosophy. That was very common then in analytic philosophy. There is nothing that science can really directly teach philosophers. That was the attitude. Notice, as Patricia Churchland has noticed very many times, this is not an attitude that Aristotle or Descartes or Leibniz or Kant or even Hegel would have shared. The idea that philosophy is self-enclosed. Now things are very different. In 40 years, not even 40 years, in 40 years, anyway, that book and Patricia and Paul Churchland, her husband, have done so much in changing our attitude with other important philosophers like Daniel Dennett or Owen Flanagan, to mention a couple. They've changed the attitude. Nowadays, very few analytic philosophers would think that you can do philosophy a priori. And her contributions in studying the mind-body problem, the problem of consciousness, the issue of personal identity, morality, free will, are all being based on this idea that you cannot do philosophy without knowing what scientists are saying about these problems, okay? So I think today Professor Churchland will give us very important inputs about the issue of freedom and how it cannot be discussed without looking at what scientists have to say about it. Professor Churchland, please.
Can you see the main slide?
Yes, yes, we can.
Right now you can see
yes, we can.
Because I don't really know what it is that you can see and I can't see. Anyway, these are just small technical things, and we can iron them all out eventually. First of all, may I apologize that I am not with you. I would so very much like to be there. This is an important meeting, and these really are important issues, as everyone who has spoken so far has mentioned. And it's so much better to interact personally, because sometimes the really interesting and important work gets done after hours, when we're having dinner or when we're walking somewhere, and I am so sorry to miss that, but under the circumstances, I really had no choice. I should also just explain that there may be a certain amount of noise, and that's because I'm in a cabin in the woods in British Columbia, and there's a whole lot of dogs around, and but anyway, we'll just carry on and not worry too much about that. And the other thing I would like to say at the outset is thank you, Mario De Carlo, for your very wonderful remarks. And thank you, Stefano, for inviting me to this. I am greatly honored and greatly pleased to be here. It was a delight to learn that the University of Notre Dame in America collaborates with LUMSA. And so it is a special treat to be at LUMSA. So the focus of the meeting has to do with freedom and how it might be impacted in AI and neuroscience. Because I'm limited to 40 minutes, I had to make a decision, and that was to focus mainly on neuroscience, and perhaps for another occasion to say something about AI. So having raised the question of human freedom, I felt that maybe I needed to think more exactly about what the particular wicked problems are. And I think that at least in the last 40 or 50 years, many philosophers have had the idea that we don't really have freedom of choice unless our decisions are not caused, if they are, or if they are caused, if they're caused by some non-physical mental event. And of course, that seems very implausible now. And it seems most likely that brains are part of the whole causal story of how decisions come about, and that non-conscious states play a very important role in the decisions that are made. For example, in speaking, I can't possibly make a conscious decision moment by moment about what I'm going to say next. And so I have a kind of, my brain has a kind of general idea of what I'm going to say, and then very particular decisions are made such that very particular words appear. Now, some people, and I'm sorry to say Dan Dennett is one of them, has the view that this means that free will is an illusion. And I think that that's kind of a mistake, especially, and this I've argued for many years, but philosophers don't want to hear about it, is especially because all mammals and all birds have some degree of self-control. And self-control is important in, for example, deferring gratification. All mammalian predators know that sometimes it's very important to lie very, very still and be very, very quiet and not to immediately leap after the prey. So self-control is a very important part of the mammalian brain, and self-control can be learned and it can be developed. It can also be compromised in various ways, for example, by use of drugs or as a result of brain damage of one kind or another. Let's move on to slide 3. So if we take the view that it's important to have freedom because we need to hold people responsible, then a question is really, when is it appropriate? When is it morally correct to hold someone morally responsible? Now, Dan Dennett has the view that most of us are going to conclude that if free will is an illusion, in the sense that we don't have these non-physical ways of making decisions, that people will think that anything is okay. But of course, that seems to me to be a mistake, that people in general think that we need to hold others morally responsible. And Aristotle understood this very well, as did David Hume, as did many other thinkers in the history of human thought about this. And the point being that moral responsibility really arrives as a result of need for a social need for civil behavior. We need to socialize children so that they can interact appropriately. We need to protect ourselves from others who might wish to take advantage of us or to hurt us. We need to deter antisocial behavior. And yes, we do need to institutionalize revenge. And that is because when terrible things are done by one person or two persons to others, then if there is no institution for revenge, they are most apt to take action themselves in order to get revenge. And so moral responsibility really arises for humans in general, not just those who have a religion, but those who have no religion. And such as, for example, the Inuit in the Canadian Arctic, who had no religion, but they had a very well-developed sense of moral responsibility. We'll get back to that in a moment. Now, in thinking about moral responsibility, it's useful to remind ourselves of what the criminal law says, which is that two conditions really have to be satisfied in order to hold someone criminally responsible. And the first is there must be criminal intent. That is, the person must intend to carry out, to be resolved to carry out a certain action, despite the fact that the action is criminal. And they must have knowledge that what they are doing is recognized by others as being wrong, mens rea. And then, of course, what has happened is over the many, many years in which we have had a criminal law, there have been recognitions that there often are ways in which, when you reflect on a particular case, you see that there need to be excuses. That if someone was coerced to do something, for example, or if the action was involuntary, then of course you don't have mens rea. If it was reflexive, you don't have mens rea. Or if the person was simply completely ignorant of the law or what was recognized as a legal restriction. And finally, of course, there are self-control deficits. And they are not always recognized, needless to say, as excusing one from responsibility. Now, there are a number of prototypes where there is a contrast between in control, and we can think of those as sort of the default cases for the purposes of argument. And there are cases where control is compromised. But it's very complicated in the case of a criminal law because humans who are deciding a case of a criminal responsibility have to figure out whether or not, under the conditions, such as sleepwalking, for example, if someone claims to have been sleepwalking, whether that really does constitute compromised control and the person is not held responsible. Now, in the United States, almost no cases where the defendant has pled sleepwalking has that been considered a justifiable excuse. Now, slide 8. What do we really know neurobiologically about the nature of self-regulation and self-control? And this certainly is being studied in animals such as mice and rats. But suffice it to say that there are many, many open questions. We do not really understand how it is that self-control and self-regulation work. We know that when children, for example, are discouraged from doing something and then they refrain from doing that thing, that their reward system gives them reinforcement. They say, well, good job, and it makes them feel good. But there are many, many aspects to the story about self-regulation and self-control that we really don't understand. Now, of course, next slide, this should be number 9. The real question, though, behind all of this where we ask, is it right to hold someone morally responsible, is, well, okay, but where do moral values themselves come from? And across many cultures, there have been basically three rather different answers. The first is divine authority, that there is some sort of God somewhere or other who lays down the rules. And the Ten Commandments are often cited as examples in point. Pure reason is another one, and biology, which was thought by, sorry, we'll go back to that slide. This is still slide 9, that there is a role for biology, there is a role for reason. This was the view both of David Hume and of Aristotle and of many thinkers in between, that reason can't really be entirely separated from biology, and you don't want to entirely separate it from other states like emotions and so forth. And of course, neurobiologically, we know almost nothing about what reason is. Slide 10, please. Now, in 1975, Ed Wilson made this observation that the evolution of human sociality is the fundamental conundrum of biology. And his point really was this, next slide, that we really don't understand in humans or in other mammals or birds what it is that makes us social, what it is that under certain conditions, individuals, this is true of all mammals, individuals will incur a cost themselves in order to help another one, in order to do something for somebody else at a cost to oneself. And we form groups. Many mammalian species live in social groups, and they get along and they cooperate. And the question is, how did that come to be? Now, one way of looking at it is this, that for all organisms, from the simplest single-cell organisms to very complicated mammalian brains, the deepest level of value has to do with oneself, with the emotional and motivational systems for survival and for well-being. And although this is the deepest level of value, there are other levels of value. However, slide 12, please. Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene didn't really see that there was a good way biologically of going beyond that deepest level of value. And so he said, let us try to teach generosity and altruism because we are born selfish. Well, yes, but also no. It turns out that like other mammals, we are born with the capacity to the capacity to share, to cooperate, to incur a cost to ourselves. Now, Darwin actually had a view that was more like that of Aristotle, Confucius, and David Hume, which was that our moral sense or our conscience depends on three things: social instincts, or what we would now call genetically based wiring, habits and skills, which also are learned but can take advantage of basic wiring for reward and reinforcement. But finally, also for problem solving in very specific contexts. Slide 14. Now, several of the speakers, Dominique in particular, has pointed out that yes, humans are special in many ways, but in a certain sense, each mammalian species is special in its own way. And here, for example, we're looking at chimpanzees where one is consoling another. And we see instances of this kind of behavior, not just in chimpanzees, but also in bonobos, in gorillas, in orangs, but also even in non-primates, We see pro-social choice. We see orphan adoption. Chris Besh, who studied chimpanzees in the wild in Africa, had found 5 different instances where a male chimpanzee adopted a baby who was orphaned and reared it to adulthood. And that takes a huge amount of effort. That is a cost. And you might say, well, I bet the males who did that were the biological fathers. So Chris Besh had one of his graduate students collect the urine, do the DNA test. No, they were not. The males who adopted the babies were not the biological fathers. And we see also self-control in other mammals. We see cooperation, we see reasoning. Now, let's go to slide 15. And here, this is just kind of an aside, and maybe this is kind of an aside to those philosophers, perhaps still a bit of the a priori persuasion, who say, well, look, you can't talk about any of this stuff until you have hardcore definitions, precise, clear definitions of the concepts. Now, Eleanor Roche was a psychologist in the 1970s and 80s who made the observation that almost all of our non-scientific categories, and that's many, many, many categories, are radial in the sense that they have core cases where we all agree, for example, that something is a house. And then we have outside cases at the periphery where everybody agrees, no, that's not a house or whatever. And then everything else is in between. And so what the observation amounted to is that categories are radial. They have this kind of loose organization, and we manage very well to talk to each other and use those categories nonetheless. And this is true of our social categories, what it is to be a friend, to be honest, to be kind, brave, trustworthy, to be moral, or to be not moral. These are categories with a radial structure. Whether they can ever achieve, or whether we should even try to get them to achieve, the kind of precision that, say, the definition of water has, or the definition of fire has, is an open question. Now let's move on to talking more about sociality in general. Now, Ed Wilson's comment about human sociality, of course, motivates us to realize that we see sociality in lots of insects, in fish, and so forth. Nevertheless, there are real differences between the sociality we see in non-mammals and birds and sociality in mammals and birds. Now, what made the difference in that kind of sociality where we see real cooperation, real consolation, and so forth? And the answer is a little bit complicated, and it's going to start in a place that might seem surprising. And the place it starts is this, that at some point before there were mammals, there were proto-mammals. And what made them special was that they were warm-blooded. So that meant that they could hunt at night, and they could hunt and live in places that were rather cold. Now, being warm-blooded, therefore, had a tremendous advantage. The other guys, the cold-blooded guys, had to sleep at night. Okay, so now we should move on to slide 17 and then to slide 18. So being warm-blooded is very, very convenient. It's a great benefit, but there is a cost. And the cost is you use 10 times the amount of energy. You can leave your pet lizard at home for 2 weeks and then come back and feed it. You can't do that with a cat or a dog. It has 10 times the energy requirements. So that puts a huge constraint on this emergent kind of mammal. And the constraint is that they better do something that allows them to get more food. And one way of doing that is to increase the learning capacity. We're now on slide 18. To increase the learning capacity. And to do that, you might want to have the animal babies born very immature so they can learn a lot. So let's look at the contrast here between a baby turtle, which is coming out of its egg, it hatches, it scrabbles down to the water, it swims off, it's done. It doesn't have to have any help from anything. On the other hand, all mammalian species are born very immature. And that means that they, in order to pay for this wonderful capacity to learn a huge amount after they're born, they need to be dependent. Now, let's just look to what we know a little bit about the brain. This is a brain of a rat, but you can see that when the rat is newborn, that it has all the neurons it's going to have, but it has very few branches on them. And at 1 month, there's huge development at 9 months, and look at 2 years, and eventually, of course, as an adult. And that kind of gives you a very graphic account of how it is that mammals learn so much and consequently are able to pay for capacity to be warm-blooded. So we'll move on to the next slide. So here's the problem. The problem is, okay, the baby mammals are going to be born very immature and hence very dependent. Who's going to take care of them? Now, it turns out basically because the mother is the one who's handy when the babies are born, that it would be a good strategy for Mother Nature, so to speak, to ensure that the mother takes care of the baby. And so what we see is something really rather unique to mammals and also to birds. And that is a very old and very wonderful, but very simple molecule, oxytocin and vasopressin, is put to a new job. And in mammals, it's put in part into the business of making milk, but also it's put into the business of bonding the mother to the baby and the baby to the mother, so that the mother, despite the fact that it can be a nuisance from one point of view, wants to be with the baby, wants to feed the baby, finds the baby's crying, worrisome, and will take care of the baby. And mother mammals, of course, are famous for taking care of babies, even under the most arduous and difficult of circumstances. So oxytocin is an absolutely critical part of the story. So where in the mammalian brain do we see that? We'll go to slide 21. Now, if we look at a sketch of the mammalian brain, it's really kind of a human brain. We see, of course, this fancy thing on the outside, which is unique to mammals, and birds have a version of it. And that's cortex. You don't see that in any reptiles. And we also see where the story of oxytocin gets its hold. In this little region right here, and you can see that blown up here in the hypothalamus, is where oxytocin is made, and you can see the red lines show the projections of neurons carrying oxytocin and depositing it in other places. For example, the amygdala, which is important for a variety of kinds of emotions, and into the anterior cingulate nucleus of the cortex, which is also very important for social interactions. So we know a little bit about oxytocin, and in the years, in the last 50 years, we've come to know a lot more. Now, how did we know that oxytocin was even part of the story of mammalian sociality? And the answer is that there are several kinds of voles, and what you see here are male and female prairie voles. But there are montane voles and prairie voles, and montane voles are more like our standard view of what a vole is like. The male and the female meet, they mate, and then they're bonded forever. The montane voles, they meet, they mate, and then they go their separate ways. But prairie voles are the ones that are very different. The male and the female meet, they mate, and now they're bonded forever. And so Larry Young, who has recently passed away, regrettably, Larry Young asked this question. So what's the difference in the brain between the montane voles, who don't have that social life, and prairie voles that do? And notice that it's not just that they're bonded for life, but the male helps take care of the babies while she goes out and forages. They sometimes, when the babies grow up, they help take care of the next litter and so forth. So it was really important to Larry that he understand the difference in the brains of prairie voles and montane voles. And in slide 23, we see Larry's slide showing the differences. Now, this is just a slice of montane vole and prairie vole. OTR means receptor for oxytocin. And in this very special area, the nucleus accumbens, which we saw earlier, in the nucleus accumbens, those receptors are very dense for oxytocin in the prairie vole. But in the montane vole, you can see there are very few receptors for oxytocin. And for vasopressin, to which it's related, oxytocin and vasopressin kind of work together. Then we see that in the ventral pallidum, here in the prairie vole, vasopressin is very dense for receptors for vasopressin, but not the montane vole. So this set a lot of people to find out exactly the differences between other male and female species, between other social and non-social species. And the oxytocin vasopressin story has simply got more and more interesting. Well, what does oxytocin do at a behavioral level? And the answer is that, especially along with vasopressin, it will decrease defensive postures. It increases the level of care and of trust. Autonomic arousal, which is involved when an animal is afraid, for example, decreases. And oxytocin also enhances the saliency of social signals, so that if my oxytocin levels are high and you wave at me in a friendly way, then I will view that as a nice friendly wave. But if I have low oxytocin levels, I might view it as a deceptive, nasty kind of social signal. So what does oxytocin really have to do with morality then? And I think that many of us are moving to the view that the basic mechanisms of attachment that we see in very early mammals all the way through the mammalian line, those basic mechanisms of attachment are actually the mechanisms for caring. And caring is fundamentally the basis for sociality. And small genetic changes can shift the attachment portfolio. And so, for example, grizzly bears tend to be largely antisocial, save for the mother-infant connection, whereas wolves, of course, are highly social and work together, cooperate together, have a social structure, and so forth. Now, slide 26, then the attachment that we see between mother and infant, that can, as a result of genetic changes, be expanded not just to babies and others, but to other people in the group or other individuals in the group. And so there can be a kind of connection. The strongest connection is likely to remain between mother and father and baby, but it can be very, very strong to siblings, to aunts, to uncles, and just to others in the group. To slide 27. So let's go back and articulate clearly the link to morality. So sociality begets other caring, but other caring together with social learning give rise to social norms, and social norms give us, up to a first approximation, morality. And problem solving in an ecology is relevant to figuring out what norms you need, how norms should change when the ecology changes. And that kind of problem solving, as Aristotle and David Hume and Darwin realized, is the basis for morality. Now, it will look very different in bonobos and in gorillas, for example, and it looks very different in us. It looks different in us depending too on how our ecology changed. So that the Inuit living in the Arctic had certain kinds of norms that were really very suited to living under such very, very harsh conditions. And those norms were different from the indigenous people who lived in Haida Gwaii, which is a huge island off the coast of British Columbia. So, the other thing that ecologists or ethologists have discovered is that if animals like to be together and they trust each other, then cooperation can emerge. And we see this sometimes across species. And I'm going to take the liberty of telling you the story behind what's happening here. Now, what you will see in this is that there are wolves surrounding a grizzly bear. And what the grizzly bear is doing is feasting on a carcass, almost certainly an elk or possibly a moose. Okay, but who's this? Well, this is a raven. So here was what the ethologists observed, that the wolves are off in the woods somewhere. They are doing their thing. Life is casual right now. And then suddenly a raven appears, and the raven begins to get their attention. He flaps and he flaps and he flaps, pop, 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 hop, hop, hop. And the wolves have seen this before, and they know that the raven is telling them that if they follow him, they'll find something wonderful. And so they come together as a group, and 8 or 10 wolves, and off they go. And what do they find? The raven takes them to the place where the grizzly has been feasting on his carcass. And so what the wolves do is they cooperate with each other to harass and harass and harass the grizzly until the grizzly finally thinks, well, I've had quite a bit. I think I'll just leave. And he takes off. Okay, well, that's nice. But you might think, well, what's the raven on about here? Well, it turns out that, and this is a wonderfully complicated and intelligent raven, The raven goes back and tells his brothers and sisters and friends and whatnot, there are goodies to be had. And now he leads all of these ravens to the wolves that are feasting on the leftovers from the grizzly. And what did the ravens do? They harass the wolves, drive the wolves off, who now basically say, well, we've had our fill, it's their turn. They leave, and the raven eats. Now, this is a really important story in certain ways because of the nature of the cooperation across social species. And ethologists and others have studied this kind of interaction between species and found that very strong bonds, for example, so this is now slide 29. Strong bonds can form between an orang and a dog. The orang was in a shelter for primates. The dog wandered in. The dog wandered over to the orang, and they became fast friends. And now they do everything together. They swim together. They share food. They cuddle up together, and so forth. And this must feel good to them. It feels right to them. Now, I want to go back and talk a little bit about problem solving, because I think problem solving involves both social norms about how to do things and what's not acceptable and what's dangerous and what's punishable and so forth. But it also involves the kinds of technological changes. So here what you see are these amazing kayaks built out of bear hides that are used by the Inuit in the Arctic. And they do all kinds of wonderful things in those kayaks, including get seals, but also bring in whales. But look at the boat of a very different kind of condition with very different kind of materials at hand. These are the Haida Indians on the Haida Gwaii Island. And the seas can be very rough. They have these remarkable boats with these remarkable prows, and they have boats. Notice how they have a keel on there. And so the norms for boat making are like the norms for sociality and how to get along in very harsh climates. And because I have a great fondness for the Inuit and a great fondness for how they manage to solve certain kinds of problems in a social context without following the kinds of norms that others, for example, the Haida might follow. So here's an example. If two males are very fond of one and the same female, and they can't seem to settle their differences, and they start to be very rough and rowdy with each other, that causes problems within the group. And so here's what they do. They call a meeting and they say, okay, you guys, we are going to have a competition, and you will each perform songs and dances and stories, and we will decide which is the best. And they do. And the competition may go on for several days. The listeners make a decision as to who is the best. And if one of them the guy who wasn't chosen as the best can't accept that, he has to leave. And of course, living on your own in the Arctic is essentially a death sentence. So they don't reprimand, they don't kill, they solve this in what I think is a unique and uniquely wonderful way. Now, just to end quickly here, let me just point out a couple of things that, because there's so much research on social norms and their sensitivity to changes in ecological conditions. But it's important to remember that there are many kinds of learning when we learn how to get along in a social context. There's instrumental learning. There's learning by imitation, there's learning skills and habits, there's learning by counterfactuals. We tell somebody, well, suppose you did this, then that would happen and that wouldn't work. And of course, imitation is tremendously important. And we come to feel very strongly when we learn by imitation certain kinds of norms as being acceptable. Now, someone mentioned Owen Flanagan as a philosopher who had rather, with whom I shared the view that a priori philosophy was perhaps not as productive as one might wish. And Owen made this set of observations about norms that I found very helpful, because sometimes philosophers think, if they are in an a priori frame of mind, that there must be a set of norms and they must be hierarchical and this one must trump that one under very specific conditions. And of course, it isn't really like that. And norms are complex for all kinds of reasons. They conflict with preferences, they conflict with other norms. Um, and they vary across our lives. They vary within an individual across one's life. And they vary within a day. Sometimes it's easy to be, sometimes it's easy to be morally upstanding in the morning. And then at night, when you're very tired and very hungry, it's a little harder. Now, I think it's also worth reminding ourselves that by and large, human groups did not have organized religion with any kind of moral source until well after the advent of agriculture. The Inuit and the Haida, who of course had very complex norms and did very well with their styles of lives. They kind of believed that, the polar bear was sort of a god and that kind of thing, but they didn't have anything like God as a lawgiver. And that really came much later. The theory, of course, is that God, the lawgiver, who's unseen, um, was an invention that came into being, again, for rather good reasons, to solve a certain kind of problem. And the problem was, when people are way off on their own doing things, we need them to do the right thing, even though there aren't a lot of other folks around to remind them what the right thing is. So morality is a critical part of what makes us what we are, but the fundamental moral rules, well, maybe there aren't fundamental moral rules. Maybe there are things about caring, but circumstances can make us feel, as we think about it and as we try to understand it in the context of others, can make us feel differently. So in my last slide then, I just want to sort of sum up the hypothesis, which is that in mammalian and avian sociability, the platform really is oxytocin, but also, and I didn't mention this earlier, the cannabinoids, which make us feel good, the endogenous cannabinoids that, along with oxytocin, can make us feel good when we have a social interaction that we like and that is productive and so forth. Or when we have a social interaction where we incur a cost to ourselves to help another. We provide consolation, we provide parenting, and that makes us feel very good. And norms emerge from problem solving, and they are learned by the reward system. It doesn't mean that they're nothing. It doesn't mean that they're unimportant. They're extraordinarily important. And in order for us to be social organisms that live on into the future, as things are changing, we need to take our norms very seriously. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we have a little more than 5 minutes, no more. If anybody has very quick questions or question. I have one, perhaps. It's clear from, you gave something like probably necessary conditions for the emergence of norms, for humans at least. And so what normativity is, why we should do things, what are the advantages. So we learned that this would be advantageous in some sense. But then going a little further, when we talk about free will, freedom, we think that we should do these things, but sometimes we don't. And it seems to us that we choose to do or not to do these things. Now, barring counter-causal conceptions of free will, that's are obsolete. We don't want that.
Doesn't work, yeah.
Yeah, so, but there are other views about free will, like compatibilist views, for which we could even be determined, but still we would be free if we do some things consciously choosing to do them, even if our will is entirely determined. So that's a standard view, a basic view.
Yeah.
So what do you think of this? It's exactly what free will would be.
Well, I think, the basis of that view really has to do with self-control, and it has to do with having enough self-control to avoid certain kinds of things that we know would be hurtful to someone else or that would be hurtful to ourselves. So whatever the mechanisms are for self-control, the story is going to be very, very complex. And we do want, nevertheless, I mean, the compatibilists are right about this. We want, nevertheless, to hold people responsible for what they do, because otherwise we can't live in a social context. And that's why, we have laws, and sometimes we change the laws, or we change the criminal system a little bit this way or a little bit that way to make it more in line with what people's emerging views are about being fair. But I mean, I guess, yeah, it seems to me that real decisions are made by humans all the time. They're not without causal antecedents, and they do involve non-conscious antecedents. And we just have to recognize that that's the case. But having done that, we also have to recognize that sometimes in the context of holding a person responsible, maybe we should say, well, maybe not this time because he really didn't know, or he really was sleepwalking, or what have you. And if you want to call that compatibilism, I mean, I don't really care what you call it, but I mean, it is kind of the standard view that I think most legal scholars have about choice too, is that, and certainly, in the case of non-human mammals, we see that badly behaved chimpanzees get punished. They get beat up by the alpha male. Or if the alpha male starts behaving badly, then others will form a band, and they will sort of lick him and say, look, you got to cut that out. So punishment and sociality are absolutely critical to our well-being. And if you want to call that compatibilism, or philosophers do, then, I don't really care what you call it. There's too many isms in philosophy. I mean, there was a time when all philosophers, if you didn't have your own ism, you were hardly worth taking seriously. And I think that time has sort of moved on.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, please. Oh, there is one question. Perhaps you want to come here, otherwise. Very good.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and privileged to see you give your. Well, I want to ask you a question from your final hypothesis. It seems to me in your presentation that that you emphasize, maybe let me call it the chemical part, the oxytocin, and I guess the animals, very higher animals, they have that also. And you talk about problem solving. Now, in the higher animals, we have both these chemical parts, the oxytocin, and then we have that act of problem solving. Can we say then that they have this ability for moral representation in the higher animals, or if they don't have, if they have these two, if you like, factors, why is it that it's only humans that have that, that could be said to be moral being, if you like? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think it's quite wrong to say that only humans have moral sense or abide by moral norms. I think it's absolutely demonstrable that other animals do. Certainly, wolves do. Chimpanzees. I mean, I think the story that Chris Besh has. I mean, he was a wonderful ethologist, and he studied for many years in Africa. But his observation about male chimpanzees adopting baby orphans and teaching them to do things, having them ride on their backs, sharing their food with them. If that isn't morality, I don't know what the heck is. That's about as moral as it gets, it seems to me. And we see comparable things in the case of wolves. And they show compassion to one another. They'll cooperate with one another. They may do things that you would say, well, that's not very nice. Well, yeah, but, certainly there's human groups who do things that you might say is not very nice as well. So, no, I think that is very clear, both from animal studies on their with regard to behavior, and with regard to the wiring, and with regard to the development of care and sociality, that we see lots and lots of kinds of morality in non-human mammals. You think ours is the best? Well, Jesus, I don't know. I mean, maybe the Inuit is better than what's current in the American system. I don't know. But it's certainly different. And is our morality really that much better than that of the bonobos or the wolves? I don't know. I mean, it's different. Okay, fine, it's different. And given our particular situation, we have to deal with ourselves and our kinds of ecological changes and our kinds of technical developments. But I think it doesn't advance any understanding of morality to say humans alone are moral. I mean, it's like Dan Dennett saying only humans are conscious because you have to have language to be conscious. Well, nuts. I mean, it's quite clear that given the data we now have on animal behavior as well as on animal brains, that of course lots and lots of mammalian species are conscious, probably even rats and mice to some degree. Is it different from ours? Yeah, well, sure. But is mine different from my neighbor's? Yeah, well, probably. So, yeah, I don't think that we advance our understanding of humanism, shall we say, by thinking that we alone are conscious or that we alone have morality. Yeah, I mean, we alone maybe have a criminal court system that's really elaborate, but, okay, fine. That doesn't make us wonderful.
Okay, so we thank you. Oh.
Just 1 minute. Thank you so much, Patricia, for your terrific speech. While listening to you, I was thinking of the two main concerns of ethics. The one is sociality, so how to behave good in society, and the second one is the human flourishing. So you were very clear about sociality, but I was wondering what does it mean in your perspective to be human, to be fully human? Could you clarify this point a little bit? I think we run out of time, but
Yeah, okay.
yeah.
I'll try to be brief.
Yeah.
I don't think there is a single answer. I think the Inuit have a very wonderful way of being human. I think that probably our early ancestors, as they roved around Africa and then roved around Europe, had perfectly wonderful ways of being human. And that cultures that are very different from ours may well have wonderful ways of being human. They may also sometimes, like us, have rather nasty ways of being human. And it's apparent, for example, that a number of people in social groups tended to enslave other people, sometimes for a while or sometimes permanently and so forth. And that's pretty nasty, but also, of course, there's less need for slaves now because we have all of these technological advances. So I think the more one encounters indigenous people and how they managed their lives, given the restrictions that they had and so forth, that was a perfectly wonderful way of being human. We're just facing now in our part of the world, we're facing very new ways of being human given the advances in technology. And someone said, I think it was Dominique in his comments, that that's not going to, how to deal with that is not going to have a technical answer. It's going to have an answer that's kind of rooted in our social nature. And I think that's right. Not all answers are technical answers. Some of them really have to do with, the kinds of organisms we are. We haven't evolved very much over the last 200,000 years. I mean, biologically, we haven't evolved. Okay, well,
thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your time. There's so much I have to learn from you, and I wish I could be there.
Bye, then.
Thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you very much, Mario. We are going to have Mario as keynote speaker in a couple of days.